Hello, and welcome to Cartography, Section 1, Lecture 1. In this presentation, I'm just going to go a little bit into generally what cartography is about and kind of hint at what it is you can expect to learn throughout the semester. So here's my crazy map slide. Maps, maps, maps. Maps come in all shapes and sizes nowadays. It used to be that, you would just have a piece of parchment or a piece of paper and there your map would be. But maps are three-dimensional, and they represent all different kinds of phenomenon. We have old maps, we have online maps, we have street maps, we have artistic maps, dot density maps. There are all kinds of maps, and all of them have different goals in mind and are represented in different ways. And as we'll learn in this class, you can make any kind of map you want, and we'll learn some of the basic skills that go into making all these different kinds of cool maps. So to begin, let's do the really sort of boring sounding but necessary process of defining our terms. So cartography is, according to a dictionary definition, the production of maps, including construction of projections, design, compilation, drafting, and reproduction. But more than that, I like to elucidate it with a little more detail. Cartography is any activity in which the presentation and use of maps is a matter of basic concern. It's also the process of designing, compiling, and producing maps. But most importantly, and this is what I like to highlight, obviously I did that with the orange letters, the art, science, and technology of making maps, together with their study as scientific documents and works of art. Okay, so we have some idea what cartography is, broadly speaking. What are the goals of cartography? We know cartographers make maps, but what does that mean? What do maps actually represent? Well, when you first talk about it, you might think of a map as offering you physical guidance to and through a place. So you think of a trail map or a map that's sitting in a park when you first enter and it shows you where the lakes and the parking lots are. Maps also are commonly showing data that regarding places and phenomena that answer a question or present an argument, such as a choropleth map or a dot density map or something that shows the numbers of Democrats and Republicans per state. I mean, we see those maps all the time these days. Those are a certain kind of map as well. But what I like to emphasize here as the ultimate goal of cartography, and I kind of hinted at this in 2 slides ago, is it's about communication. Maps, no matter what it is you're trying to achieve with your map, what it is you're doing is actually communicating something, regardless of what it is. You want to communicate something and you have to do it in a way that's effective and it's appropriate and excuse me, appropriate to your audience and to your message, what you're trying to convey. So it's about communicating with other people. So with this slide, I just wanted to talk briefly about the history of cartography. As you might imagine, there's a whole fantastic history to it. Maps are deeply embedded within human culture, going back millennia. From the time humans could wander away from their campfire and come back and live to tell about it, we've been making maps. And they're deeply tied to a whole bunch of political, religious, intellectual, and economic forces. So it's not even worth me going into the history of cartography other than to say that you can watch this nice little video for a sort of entertaining look at the history of cartography and its role that it's played in how we have explored and perceived the world throughout history. So I'd like to ask, who is a cartographer? Because you hear the word cartography or cartographer and you think somebody who went to cartography school. Well, yes, you can actually study cartography in a graduate program and become educated in that manner with cartography. But in many cases, a lot of people become cartographers, so to speak, through a different variety of other routes. But in reality, anybody who studies the subject and can apply the tools of the trade can really be a cartographer, as long as you're, like with most things that produce a visual element, if you can produce a portfolio of good maps and have a good show that you are good at it, then you can actually claim to be a cartographer to a degree. But like I said, you have to know the tools of the trade. In many cases, you need to know GIS and get to know GIS, which is Geographic Information Systems, which is something we will be going on a lot, covering a lot more throughout this class. So if you don't know anything about it, don't worry about it. And also desktop publishing. We are not going into desktop publishing, but by that I mean things like Illustrator, InDesign, and any other software system where you can do a lot more in-depth and detailed work with creating publishable documents. But you can create perfectly fine and very good maps just with the GIS system that we'll be using in this class, which is ArcPro. But a cartographer also has to understand geospatial data and apply the tools that we talked about above to geospatial data, which again, we'll go into what geospatial data is in more detail throughout the semester, but just suffice it to say, geospatial data is any kind of information that has a location attached to it. And by location, we specifically mean coordinates, because coordinates can be placed on a map. A cartographer also has to be someone who has an eye for design and a head for critical analysis. So I've sort of started to routinely come up to this throughout these slides, which is that cartography is about art and science. You have to be able to kind of sit comfortably in both worlds. And beyond that, cartographers often come from backgrounds such as photogrammetry, which is taking measurements from photographs, remote sensing, which is analyzing images from satellites, geospatial statistics, which looks at statistical analysis through geospatial data, and geodesy. Geodesy is the science of studying the shape and dimension of the planet, of the actual planet we are on, of Earth. So quick and easy one here. Who uses cartography? Who needs it? We all do. We actually, in the age of smartphones and Google Maps, we consume cartographic products all the time. And we see, I think we can actually, it's safe to say, many people probably take for granted the presence that maps play in their life. We use them all the time to communicate and look at, or other institutions use it to communicate and talk about economic data, social data, like all kinds of stuff presented on maps. And we just sort of let it wash over us and maybe don't even quick analyze it for veracity, but we are presented with cartographic products all the time. And the people who need it are, again, it's the needs are broad, so you could actually take your skills as a cartographer that you learned in this class and apply it to a lot of different settings and institutions. So as I mentioned before, the cartographer's tools are GIS, Geographic Information Systems, and or desktop publishing systems. But don't take for granted that you also need, a cartographer will also need a calculator, pen and paper, a camera, a junk compass, a GPS device. All these things go into creating maps and gathering data and selecting the kind of data you'll be using in a map. So just briefly to talk about the sort of workflow is the term I like to use of the cartographic communication process. So somebody says to you, I need a map, or they tell the cartographer they need a map of something. The first thing the cartographer asks are who will use it? Does it need to be a general map for the general public, or is it for a specialized audience? How will it be used? I mean, physically, how will it be accessed? Is it going to be something that is printed and handed out as a pamphlet, or is it going to be online on a smartphone? And what kind of map is it? Do we need a reference map, which is sort of a general map of an area or a region, versus a thematic map, which shows a specific issue or condition that you're trying to display? So once you sort of answer those questions, the first thing the cartographer does is actually assess the reality, meaning the geographic environment and also the data, what kind of data is out there and that they'll get access to. Since they've gathered all that information, the cartographer then goes through a process of selecting, simplifying, symbolizing, and classifying all the information that they've gathered. Again, looking back at the top of this list, their cartographer has to take all of that information and apply it based upon their answers to the top. of who will use it, how will it be used, and what kind of map. They then go through the design process, the testing process, the editing process, and they produce their final map. So as fabulous as maps are, there are limitations to a printed static map. And I just gave part of that away, which is that it's a static image. It's not always, as we'll see with in later slides, but traditionally maps are problematic because they are just sort of a single snapshot of the way something is or perceived to be at a given point in time. Like any object or subjective communication, it's subject to interpretation by the reader and by the author. So misinterpretations can happen. People will see what they want to see. You can leave key information out to obtain a certain objective. So there's a variety of things that can happen or go wrong with maps. Similarly, they're subject to inference and inexactness because maps can't actually show every single thing that is going on in a physical location. And this is because it contains selected information, generalized data, abstracted symbology, and distortion. These are four very important ideas we'll cover in the coming weeks. But it's just to say that the truth of maps is that there's always something missing. So you as a cartographer have to be careful about what you select to put on the map because not everything can go on there. But in your selection process, you have to be very intentional about what you're doing and faithful to the subject that you're representing. So in this class, as it has already been stated, we're using GIS in the form of ArcPro to learn about and produce our maps. And like I said before, the production of maps through this is excellent. You can make great maps that you can print, but also more importantly, publish online, which is very important. Exclusively using GIS for cartography can be very advantageous. It can be much cheaper, or it is much cheaper than going more traditional publishing routes. It speeds up the cartographic process. Typically, if you're just a cartographer, say without any GIS, you'd be doing all of your calculations of coordinates and projections with pen and paper on a calculator, which, if you know anything about GIS, is actually kind of unfathomable because within GIS on this computer we can calculate do all these complex calculations and get very accurate maps that otherwise would take a long time to do. And as a result of this, you can actually quickly experiment with different kinds of information and with the appearance of the map and how things are symbolized. You can also produce interactive maps, and you can easily interact with the data. So you can, again, quickly and easily go through everything. And it's dynamic. You can actually create maps that show change over time. And you can create maps that people can interact with and use in a more personal and subjective way. So there are limitations to using GIS for cartography. You know, it's like anything else out there. Not all automated systems are perfect, and not everything can be automated. You can't just hit a button and it's going to make a map. You still have to put a lot of effort into making something that looks good and that says what you want it to say. And perhaps, kind of importantly, things like the more quickly and easily maps can be produced, it means there's greater opportunity for people to abuse them and create misinformation. So in this world of Facebook misinformation and misnews on Facebook and whatnot, this is an example of how that can happen, because you can create really professional looking maps that are very persuasive, but actually are maybe inaccurate and are causing people to think differently than they should, or ought to think, rather. So last, I like to just present the philosophy of the map. Remember that maps are static. Printed maps are static. Well, in GIS, data often changes, so that by using GIS to do cartography, we can more easily make up-to-date maps that are accurately reflecting the world as it is. But given that, we have to remember that any map is a snapshot in time. Like any material, maps have a message and an audience, and they need to be clear and easily understood, and communication happens through good visual design as well as good science. So again, these are very important considerations we'll go over. And because maps are tools for communication with a human author, they're always subject to bias. So remember that not only when you make maps, when you look at other people's maps. And as such, you should always cite your source materials and statistical methods. So we'll cover this in a lot more detail over the coming weeks. So last, just to go over what you will get from this class. I'm hoping you'll come away with basic visual communication and graphic skills. We're going to go over concepts such as typography, color selection, layout, so things that are very important just for creating something that's pleasing to the eye and easy to read and that makes sense. You'll also gain competency in working in ArcPro and ArcGIS Online, which are critical skills to have not just for cartography, but also for doing all kinds of spatial analysis and data analysis that I think is helpful in a variety of industries and subject matters. And also you'll learn how to analyze data for meaning and faithfully represent it. So you'll be able to look at information and also think about ways that it can be presented and communicated about in a physical map that's presented. Okay, that's it for now. I will make another lecture for next week. And until then, have a great time. Bye.